So it's been, as I said earlier on, quite a week, especially when you consider it's only Tuesday. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's statement, of course, the resignation, the proroguing of Parliament until March 24th, and so many questions that remain unanswered. Marc Miller is a federal immigration minister, and I think fair to say one of Justin Trudeau's oldest friends. They've known each other for a long, long time. Minister, I thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Let me begin.
Thanks for having me on, Ed.
Yeah, let me begin by asking, first of all, you obviously, and I think most people within the party knew this was coming. Anything you heard yesterday surprise you?
No, it was classy. I think for a lot of people, it was obviously for everyone a historic moment in Canadian history, but it was a painful one for a lot of us that got into politics because of Justin Trudeau, what he represented, what he continues to represent. What I heard yesterday was consistent with what I know of him. As you mentioned, our friendship, it's been since 1984, since we've known each other, studied together, been friends for that period of time through thick and thin, but been professional colleagues for 10 years. And, I've spent a ton of time over the last few months with him, having conversations about options, about his future. And he is to a fault focused on the impact of any decision he has to make on Canadians and the country that he loves. And you heard that yesterday. It was his decision was the right one for the nation, but it isn't one that leaves him without remorse or regret, and rightly so, because he's a human. And these decisions, if they don't hurt, you probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, because he still has some fight in him, Aaron. He mentioned it yesterday. He's a fighter. People may accuse him of going a couple rounds too long, but he's a passionate guy, and that's what got him to be Prime Minister, is exactly what he has in his guts, and he still thinks he's got it in him to beat Pierre Poilievre and present to Canadians a view of the country that he loves, but he realized that he'd become, I think, a lightning rod for a number of things, and he is smart enough to know that he can't fight a battle on 2 or 3 fronts and not have that affect Canada and Canadians' decision about him and about our party. So he made the right decision yesterday, even though it does come with some regret.
There was some talk. I actually spoke to Stephen Marr earlier in the afternoon. When we talk about why he waited as long as he did, we know he was away at Christmas, spending time with his family. Your name actually came up directly. So did Dominic LeBlanc, suggesting that maybe you, and I'm sure you were talking to him at the time, certainly from the position of a friend, someone he's known for so long. Did you try to convince him to delay this, to change his mind? What was that conversation like?
Aaron, to be fair, and the discussions that I have professionally with the Prime Minister are ones that I will take to my grave. I think a lot of that has been misconstrued. There was certainly, the Prime Minister cares deeply about his cabinet and about the people around him that are fighting every day for Canadians, and was quite open about how he felt in the wake of the resignation of his Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. And people took that to mean a lot of things. I don't think he intended at that point to resign, so there's not the ability to have a conversation about resignation or not. The immediate concern from the resignation of Chrystia Freeland was to make sure that the country was being best served with the decisions that we needed to make in the immediate day, 24 to 48 hours. That included the nomination of Dominic LeBlanc to Finance Minister, and the continued reflection that he was having over a period of months about his decision whether to stay or whether to go. I think he probably thinks that he should be the person to beat Pierre Poilievre, but he knew out of the love for his country and a lot of love for Canada that it could not be him. That, to my earlier point, leads to feelings of some remorse and some regret, but he was serene in his decision, and again, it was the right decision to take. As a friend, but most importantly as a professional colleague, I walked through a number of options with him, and those are things that I would never discuss.
Okay, so there was some wavering on his point, in his position. That's sort of what I'm getting from your comments. This wasn't about, I've made up my mind and this is what I'm going to do, and there was still some wavering?
Look, I think it's safe to say that his final decision really congealed certainly over the course of the last few days, but over the course of the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
We've all been under fire for months. We spend time, our waking hours, serving Canadians as elected officials, and so we should. But he obviously needed to take the time to be with his family and to celebrate Christmas, which is two things that he takes quite seriously. So that reflection, I think, solidified over the course of the last 2 weeks, over a period where most people are taking some holidays.
All right, let me ask one other thing. Relative to what he said yesterday, it's been suggested it was somewhat disingenuous when he was asked, and I realize you're put on the spot, right? At that particular moment, someone said, "What are your biggest regrets?" And the one thing he brought up, the first thing and only thing, as it turns out, he did say he's sure there'll be others. He brought up this idea of Canada's voting system. And when we talked to people after the fact, they said, well, isn't that rich when he had the opportunity to change this when he did have a majority government, yet chose not to? Yet that's the first thing he brought up, asking if there were any regrets. Did that strike you as odd?
No, but I lived through that, Aaron, and the details of the back and forth within Parliament. We had a majority at that point in time, and yes, whoever told you that is accurate in saying we could have rammed it through. I had personal beliefs that wanted us to keep the first past the post system. It's something that I like, but I subscribed to the Prime Minister's view and supported a look into electoral reform, which included different forms of proportional representation that would allow Canadians to make sure that their preference was accurately reflected in a Westminster system that can give people with 33% of the vote a majority in Parliament. And for some people that seems unfair. I think, given our history, it is fair. But the Prime Minister, when we were reflecting on the lack of consensus that the work that we did earlier on in our government yielded, which was some views on first past the post, some views on proportional representation, preferential ballots, it was clear there was no consensus. And yes, we could have rammed it down people's throats. But again, the Prime Minister, to a fault, worries about the impact that has on the nation and on Canadians, and rightly felt that he couldn't move forward on that type of reform and the divisive nature that would have caused within Parliament, within Canada, if it's simply one party ramming through its preference. And I respect him for that. But people are accurate in saying that technically he could have rammed it down people's throats. I give him a lot of credit for choosing not to do it, and he had that option. All
right. Let me ask this, and you brought up Chrystia Freeland. I think we can all agree that the Chrystia Freeland incident was the straw that broke the camel's back. Is that fair to say?
I think there were a lot of elements. The departure of a finance minister and the deputy prime minister weighs heavily. It's certainly not the only factor, but I'm not going to tell people on air that it didn't weigh into the influence and the decision making process. But there was a number of factors over the course of the last 6 months that weighed into it, including what was going on in his caucus, which was creating those multi-front battle, particularly with the threats of job-crushing tariffs that the Trump administration is threatening on inauguration against Canada. And I think his focus, again, to a fault, was to make sure that he took himself out of the equation of the party dynamics and focus, frankly, on what's happening to the south of us. And indeed, proof of that is that he showed up to a meeting he didn't have to, our subcommittee on Canada-U.S. relations, and was part of that discussion where we were discussing the appropriate response to whether and when the Trump administration imposes tariffs.
How much did poll, and I realize perhaps that's not a question I can get a fair answer to. You talk about Chrystia Freeland being one of the things perhaps that was a motivating factor for him ultimately to leave, people within the caucus stepping away, deciding not to run again. Those things start adding up. I understand that. But when polling numbers go from bad to worse to worse to worse, at some point, don't you sit back and go, okay, with a 25% or 25% difference, I guess, in between the Conservatives and the Liberals, there was no hope of winning an election. Right. I mean, at some point, don't you look at those numbers and decide the best thing for the party is for me to step down?
A lot of politicians that you have on air, including commentators, will say publicly that we don't look at polls. That's never really that true. There are, that said, a number of politicians that pay less attention than others. I've seen provincial governments basically govern their media cycle by poll. It leads to disastrous outcomes. What I do give credit to the Prime Minister on is he does pay attention to public sentiment. He has to, or else it costs you pretty quickly your job. But you can't be governed by poll alone. In May of 2015, we were totally in the dumps, and within 3 months, we had a majority. So things do change. Elections do count, and I give credit to the Prime Minister's guts and fighting sentiment to think that he could pull this off. He just was smart enough to realize he couldn't do that with 3 or 4 battles, and frankly, the lack of reliable horses to take us all in a unified way into battle, and to the extent that he was the polarizing force there, I think it was smart from him to take himself out of that equation.
I don't want to dwell on this. I do want to get your take on it, though. I took phone calls earlier in the afternoon because there's been a great deal of discussion over what he said, his comments on Chrystia Freeland yesterday during his statement, when he talked about her having been his right hand, having worked together for 10 years. And, of course, the opposition takes that. And all our pundits said the same thing, that, in effect, what he did was throw Chrystia Freeland under the bus. In other words, made it easy for the opposition to say, look, she's no different than he is when it comes to an election. If she is leader of this party, she is basically Justin Trudeau's right hand. He admitted as much in his statement. Do you feel he threw her under the bus?
I don't think that was at all the intention. I think 2 things can be true at once. She does have different views than the Prime Minister. I've sat with her in cabinet where she has expressed those. That is part of her job as the Finance Minister, to have a robust back and forth between her and the Prime Minister's office, and frankly with me in the role when I come and ask her for money. That's a healthy feature of democracy. It's also true that she has been instrumental in pretty much everything we've done, including the important measures that we took through COVID, and she should be quite proud of that. And I hope that as part of her leadership run that she runs on that record, because it is one that's significant, and it's not necessarily dissociable from the Prime Minister. People will use that in a negative way. I would see it positively, but she's a different person, and she has her own views. She's entitled to them, and she will most certainly distinguish herself vis-a-vis other candidates. And I think that's what the party needs. So Canada needs. She's a different person than Justin Trudeau, but she has been integral to his success and integral in shaping the economic vision of the country that she has endorsed, and that you can't escape from that record either. So these are sort of 2 things that can be true at once. I don't think there was anything nefarious in what the Prime Minister said. I think it was an act of grace and graciousness.
Let me ask you one last thing before we run out of time. First of all, do you think, knowing him as well as you do, Parliament's going to be prorogued now for a couple of months till the end of March. Do you think he is done politically as a force?
I don't. I think there's some value to seeing Justin Trudeau unshackled, and he is a formidable opponent. He's still the Prime Minister. We're not in any form of caretaker scenario. He's still fully the Prime Minister of Canada. He is now has the ability to focus on governing, and that's what he will do. It's why he not only convened a cabinet meeting, but he attended our most important subcommittee right now, which is our relationship with the U.S. So I don't see him at all as a spent force. He isn't re-upping in the next election, so we'll have to, as a matter of party dynamics, choose the next leader and unify behind a new leader. But we haven't heard the last of Justin Trudeau. He just won't be presenting himself as the leader of the party for the next election, and that has a value to it. But it also has, the downside you mentioned. I just think if people think that, they're underestimating Justin Trudeau.
Last question. A lot has been already, only a day later, talked about with respect to who may succeed him. We've had as we say, the usual suspects have been named: Mark Carney, Anita Anand, Chrystia Freeland, and on and on and on. I've not heard Marc Miller's name mentioned. Are you one of those people who is poking around to see if perhaps there's some support for you as the next leader of the Liberal Party?
There's lots of support for me. Lots of people have reached out to me, Aaron. There's no chance in hell I'm running in this race for a variety of reasons. I have too much respect for the next 3 months in the position that I'm in as the immigration minister to spend my time on that. I think the government deserves and needs people in cabinet that can afford some stability during that period. So I've been and the reason people aren't mentioning it publicly is I've said equally publicly as well to the media that there's not a chance I'm running. So that pretty much answers that. But I'll be exercising my vote like every other Liberal Party member, and I'll be commenting publicly on the person that I feel is the best to lead the country into the next election. And that'll depend on a number of factors. I think the policies and the ability to speak reasonably to Canadians matters to me. And more importantly, the ability to beat Per Poilievre, which is the type of person Canadian politics hasn't seen. And I think he has the potential to be quite destructive to this country, and that worries me tremendously. It should worry all Canadians.
We'll leave it at that. Marc Miller, Canada's Federal Immigration Minister. Marc, thanks so much for the time. Always appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.